We've examined thus far in the course the nature of the Islamic totalitarian supremacist code its adherents call Sharia, and the efforts being made by the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamists to bring it to America. In Part 8, the course explored how under President Obama the penetration of the U.S. government and influence operations run against it during the previous administration have translated into even greater entree for individuals associated with the Brotherhood. In this part, we will consider the extent to which policies favored by such individuals and their friends have been adopted to the detriment of this country's values, constitution, and national security. In the closing days of the 2008 presidential campaign, Democratic candidate Barack Obama declared that he was poised to begin, quote, fundamentally transforming the United States of America, unquote. He has indisputably done so with respect to myriad policies favored by the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamists. Such policies have been promoted by the sorts of people discussed in Part 8 of this course, individuals whom his administration has engaged either as employees or in some other official or quasi-official capacity. Another factor that has contributed to their adoption are the precedents established in the previous administration, precedents described at length in Parts 3 through 7. As a means of organizing these various initiatives, we'll focus on the agency that is most closely associated with them. There is, of course, considerable overlap with policies that have application government-wide, and, needless to say, none of them would be adopted without White House approval. Indeed, many surely have their genesis with general, if not specific, presidential direction. Let's examine what is, of necessity, but a sample of Team Obama's pro-Islamist policies, starting with the White House itself. As one would expect, the executive office of the president, universally thought of as the White House, has been intimately involved in formulating and directing the execution of foreign defense, homeland security, and related judicial policies. Consider just a few examples. One of the most brilliant stratagems of the Muslim Brotherhood and their friends has been the co-option and manipulation of a key concept of successful U.S. law enforcement, community-based policing. Under the guise of the sensible practice of connecting with and developing relationships with American Muslims to ferret out and counter jihadism in their midst, brothers and their sympathizers have positioned themselves as interlocutors and arbiters of how such policing can be conducted. There are countless examples of how this gambit has translated into official U.S. government policy. The most prominent is the national strategy released by the White House on August 3, 2011, entitled Empowering Local Partners to Prevent Violent Extremism in the United States. This document and its implementation plan provide important insights into both the Obama administration's fatally flawed conception of the threat we face and the resulting deficiencies in the United States' recent and ongoing efforts to contend with the actual danger we confront from Sharia and its adherents. As its title makes plain, this strategy construes the problem as solely the threat posed by violent extremists. It emphasizes countering what the president calls, quote, Al-Qaeda's violent ideology, unquote, without acknowledging that it is the same ideology of Sharia followed by the Muslim Brotherhood, other Salafists, and the Shiite regime of Iran. More to the point, the Obama strategy excludes the possibility that nonviolent, or more accurately, pre-violent extremists are a threat as well. There is simply no recognition of the phenomenon of civilization jihad, let alone that those who are pursuing it must necessarily be seen for what they are, namely, part of the problem. Third, by submitting to the enemy's information dominance by employing euphemisms instead of accurate descriptive terms like jihad or Sharia to describe the threat, the strategy opens the door to confusion about the nature of the real threat and diversion and dilution of the effort necessary to counter it. Perhaps it should come as no surprise that a former community organizer like President Obama emphasizes in his national strategy a reliance on unspecified communities and their leaders in constructing and executing its countering violent extremism initiatives. As his plan put it, quote, "The federal government is using its convening power to help build a network of individuals, groups, civil society organizations, and private sector actors to support community-based efforts to counter violent extremism." Unquote. But what if the communities are dominated by the Muslim Brotherhood, which, thanks to its usually generous and offshore sources of funding, disciplined organizations, and coercive Sharia doctrine, gets away with presenting itself as the Muslim American leadership? On this point, the hearing convened by House Homeland Security Committee Chairman Peter King on March 10, 2011, was most instructive. It featured testimony from Melvin Bledsoe and Abdirazak Bihi, relatives of young men recruited in American mosques to acts of fatal jihad. Representative King asked a leading anti-Islamist Muslim, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy and a founder of the American Islamic Leadership Coalition, to respond to their testimony.
We have a problem internally. Where is that? It's a minority, but there's an ideology that exists in some mosques. Not all, not a majority, but in some mosques, and it's a significant number. And what I'm talking about is not the violent part. We need to change that paradigm from simply talking about violence. It is about that separatism, that idea that the Islamic State takes precedence, Islamic law takes precedence over American law. There's a lot of consolidation of thought within mosques. And one of the other things I think is important for the committee to understand is that our population is extremely diverse. But yet in this country, the groups that seem to represent us are those that are mobilized based on being an Islamic lobby, which is really part of political Islam. Most of our families left that political Islamic party mentality in the Middle East and came here to be part of a political infrastructure that separates church and state. So to say that, well, how do we engage those Muslims? Where are they? They're hard to get to because they don't want to be involved in Islamic or Muslim organizations because they separate mosque and state. Looking at the Islamists as a group, again, not all, violence is a small part of their mentality. But yet, as you look at the bigger part, they facilitate the concept that the Islamic State is supremacist, is better, Islamic law should be part of government. All this needs reform, and only we can do that. And some of the mosques, for example, get funding and have a common source of ownership called the North American Islamic Trust, listed as an unindicted co-conspirator in the Holy Land Foundation trial. They hold deed to they quote 300 mosques on their website, some say up to 50% of mosques, and yet if you look at some of the teachings that the Islamic Society of North America and a few others endorse, they're associated, and I put this in my testimony, some of their imams are associated with the Assembly of Muslim Jurists of America. So along with some of that funding that came originally from petrodollars in the 70s, comes, I think, an ideology that is pervasive with Wahhabism, which is a fundamentalist Islamist strain, or Islamism as an entity, or political Islam. Very different from Islam as a faith, I believe. We still have to go through that enlightenment process and that reform, but you can't disconnect the funding. And there have been committees in this House that have studied that. The Judiciary Committee in the Senate studied the funding issue of mosques in 2003. I think that is a whole other issue. But I do think along with it comes apologetics, a lack of reform, and a sense of basically trying to evangelize Islam rather than trying to internalize American ideals into our faith, which is two different things, so it's a significant problem.
On December 1st, 2011, President Obama compounded the strategic implications of the failure to recognize in his National Empowering Local Partners strategy the dangers associated with relying on Islamists who are not representative of the American Muslim community, yet who nonetheless insist they are its leaders. On that day, the administration rolled out an implementation plan for that strategy. It pronounced that, quote, partnerships are vital to address a range of challenges and must have as their foundation a genuine commitment on the part of law enforcement and government to address community needs and concerns, including protecting rights and public safety, unquote. The onus, thus, is squarely upon the police. The implementation plan went on to add, quote, "In our efforts to counter violent extremism, we will rely on existing partnerships that communities have forged with federal, state, and local government agencies," unquote. In other words, to the extent that Islamist groups have successfully penetrated such agencies, they can effectively lock out other authentically patriotic and therefore non-brotherhood Muslim organizations and leaders. The implementation plan also establishes ample direction for federal agencies to make concessions to Islamists, ostensibly aggrieved about unsatisfactory immigration opportunities, civil rights, or social services, but who really are seeking preferential treatment that amounts to submission to them and their supremacist Sharia doctrine. The implementation guidance confers on U.S. attorneys leadership roles in, quote, efforts to engage with communities to, one, discuss issues such as civil rights, counterterrorism, security measures, international events, foreign policy, and other community concerns; two, raise awareness about the threat of violent extremism; and three, facilitate partnerships to prevent radicalization to violence, unquote. We'll have more to say momentarily about the implications of giving U.S. attorneys the responsibility for deciding which communities should be engaged on such portentous matters. Finally, the Obama implementation plan directs a number of steps that open still greater opportunities for Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamist operatives to conduct subversive influence operations, including, quote, expanded engagement, unquote, quote, new partnerships, unquote, opening, quote, broader forums, unquote, to penetration and intensifying interactions under the rubric of countering violent extremism. President Obama's misbegotten strategy and implementation plan are made all the more ominous by his administration's establishing formal diplomatic relations with, and otherwise embracing, the Muslim Brotherhood. On June 4th, 2009, President Obama affronted then Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak by insisting that Muslim brothers be in the audience at Al-Azhar University for his first Muslim outreach address. This had the effect of emboldening the Ikhwan, as well as undermining his host. On June 30th, 2011, President Obama had his Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, announce that the United States would open relations with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. On that occasion, she said, quote, "We believe, given the changing political landscape in Egypt, that it is in the interests of the United States to engage with all parties that are peaceful and committed to nonviolence, that intend to compete for the parliament and the presidency," unquote. As we've seen throughout this course, the Muslim Brotherhood is not committed to nonviolence. It will use whatever techniques will advance its supremacist Sharia agenda most effectively, including pre-violent ones. We'll come back to this point momentarily. As we've seen throughout this course, the Muslim Brotherhood is not committed to nonviolence. It will use whatever techniques will advance its supremacist Sharia agenda most effectively, including violent ones, and certainly pre-violent ones. Let's recall, its creed declares categorically, quote, "Allah is our objective, the Prophet is our leader, the Quran is our law, jihad is our way, dying in the way of Allah is our highest hope," unquote. We'll come back to this point momentarily. The Obama administration has also wholeheartedly endorsed efforts by Turkey's Islamist Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan to encourage the Muslim Brotherhood's rise elsewhere in the Middle East. These include efforts to assure the Islamists' domination of the Syrian opposition. A prominent Syrian-American brother, Louis Safi, a past vice president of the Islamic Society of North America, was among those who were favored to lead the Syrian National Council, seen by Team Obama as the most promising alternative to dictator Hafez Assad. We'll discuss shortly other troubling roles Safi has been allowed to play in the United States. As Part 8 of this course makes plain, the Obama administration has engaged the Muslim Brotherhood in this country as well, before, during, and most especially after it embraced the organization in Egypt following the revolution there. The Ikhwan's penetration of Team Obama is, of course, not an end in itself. Rather, it is an important part of the civilization jihad, whose advance is being facilitated via other parts of the president's pro-Islamist program. This course has addressed repeatedly the Islamists' ambition of eliminating impediments to material support for terrorism that could otherwise be provided through Muslim charitable contributions known as zakat. The Holy Land Foundation trial provided insights into the utility of so-called charities in fundraising for the Muslim Brotherhood's Palestinian franchise, Hamas, and other terrorist organizations. In his first Muslim outreach speech, delivered at Cairo's Al-Azhar University on June 10, 2009, President Obama declared his intention to ensure that American Muslims can, quote, fulfill zakat, unquote. Since according to Sharia, at least 1/8 of zakat must be given to jihad, this amounted, as a practical matter, to a presidential commitment not to enforce the laws with respect to material support for terrorism, cloaked as zakat. We'll have more to say about this in connection with the Justice Department later in this part of the course. Despite Barack Obama's statements to the contrary, there has arguably never been greater daylight between the United States and Israel than has developed under his presidency. That's not an accident. It is the result of a profound personal antipathy the president appears to feel towards the Jewish state that long predates his public service. Mr. Obama's views in this regard were evidently shaped by, among others, formative influences in his life who were virulently hostile to Israel. Mentors and colleagues like Yasser Arafat acolyte Rashid Khalidi, anti-Semitic Reverend Jeremiah Wright, terrorist Bill Ayers, and anti-Zionist Rabbi Arnold Wolf. Symptoms of the strains between America under President Obama and the Jewish state abound. 3 are exemplary. First, casting the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, even Jews' construction on privately owned land in their capital city of Jerusalem, as the region's most serious problem. Second, Mr. Obama has repeatedly demeaned Prime Minister Netanyahu, both in public and in private. A particularly egregious instance of the latter occurred in March 2010, when the president treated his Israeli counterpart like, in the words of Washington Post columnist Jackson Deal, quote, an unsavory third world dictator, needed for strategic reasons, but conspicuously held at arm's length, unquote. Third, the hostility towards Israel Mr. Obama brought to the White House has only been reinforced during his time in office by the Muslim Brothers and their admirers. As we've seen, the former include Imam Mohammed Majid, who advised Mr. Obama the night before his second Muslim outreach speech in May 2011, an address that endorsed the Palestinian position by saying Israel must return to the so-called 1967 borders. As part of his exit strategy for withdrawing U.S. forces from Afghanistan, President Obama has embarked upon a program of accommodation with the Taliban, the Islamist group that gave sanctuary to al-Qaeda's Osama bin Laden prior to 9/11 and brutally repressed the people of Afghanistan in accordance with Sharia. To date, this accommodation has manifested itself in 3 ways. First, the Obama administration has sought to negotiate with representatives of the Taliban, a process that has resulted in the establishment of a diplomatic office for the group in Qatar. Such a process can, as a practical matter, only have one outcome: condemning the people of Afghanistan to a return of this toxic Sharia blight. Second, the Obama administration has utilized as one of its main interlocutors with the Taliban one of the world's most dangerous Sharia ideologues, Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi. As we've seen, he is the spiritual leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, a virulent promoter of jihadism in general and war against Israel in particular, and a driving force behind what he calls jihad with money, using zakat proceeds from Sharia-compliant finance to wage holy war. No good can come from the U.S. government legitimating, empowering, and emboldening the likes of Qaradawi. Third, President Obama is reportedly disposed to grant the Taliban a preemptive concession just for beginning negotiations by releasing these 5 top Taliban detainees incarcerated at Guantanamo Bay. Should he do so, he will ignore warnings by security personnel that once freed, these prisoners will surely return to jihad against American and Allied forces in Afghanistan and, perhaps, beyond. The five were formerly a Taliban Minister of Interior, Deputy Minister of Defense, a senior Taliban commander, a Deputy Director of Taliban Intelligence, and a senior Taliban leader described as having operational ties to anti-coalition militia groups including Al-Qaeda. Under President Obama, the previous administration's practice of hosting dinners to celebrate the breaking of the Ramadan fast has been institutionalized, with senior officials of departments government-wide expected to participate. The agencies have been encouraged not only to have their leaders officiate at these iftar dinners, but to use them as vehicles for exploring grants that might be made to the participating Muslim groups. This process helps to legitimate, enrich, and protect Islamist organizations, even as it affords them expanded opportunities for influence operations. Note that among those prominently in attendance at this iftar dinner at the State Department was Mohammed Majid, president of the Islamic Society of North America, which is, as we have seen, an unindicted co-conspirator in the Holy Land Foundation trial and the largest Muslim Brotherhood front in the United States. Given the administration's exclusive partnering with such individuals and organizations, these dinners are perfect vehicles for Islamist efforts to penetrate, influence, and subvert the U.S. government. On December 16, 2011, President Obama signed an executive order with potentially troubling implications. It expanded the restricted authorities President Reagan gave the International Criminal Police Organization, known as Interpol, in ways that would allow it police powers impermissible under the U.S. Constitution. The worrisome implications for American liberties were subsequently raised by an event half a world away. On February 2012, Interpol reportedly helped the Saudis apprehend one of their bloggers who had fled his homeland after infuriating Islamists with a Twitter posting they deemed to be blasphemous. On Twitter, Hamza Kashgari wrote of Islam's prophet Muhammad, quote, "I have loved things about you, and I've hated things about you. And there's a lot I don't understand about you. I will not pray for you." Unquote. Kashgari fled to Malaysia, where he was apprehended on the basis of an Interpol red alert and sent back to Saudi Arabia, where he may face a death sentence for apostasy. The President and his White House staff have also tasked various departments and their senior officials through both formal and informal means to adopt assorted policy initiatives and concessions favored by Islamists. Let's consider a few illustrative examples by looking at 6 agencies in turn, starting with the organization at the top of the U.S. intelligence community, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. The Obama administration's various accommodations to the Islamists have been greatly facilitated by the U.S. government's systematic breach of Sun Tzu's axiom about knowing the enemy. Consider, for example, the following exchange on February 10, 2011 between Representative Sue Myrick, the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee's Terrorism Subcommittee, and Lieutenant General James Clapper, the Director of National Intelligence.
The term Muslim Brotherhood is an umbrella term for a variety of movements. Right. In the case of Egypt, a very heterogeneous group, largely secular, which has eschewed violence and has decried Al-Qaeda as a perversion of Islam. Right. They have pursued social ends, betterment of the political order in Egypt, and et cetera. And then in the other,
it's not a violent side I'm interested in. I'm interested in their nonviolent side, which I was talking about.
And in other countries, there are also chapters or franchises of the Muslim Brotherhood, but there is no overarching agenda, and particularly in pursuit of violence, at least internationally.
Now, given what you've learned thus far about the Muslim Brotherhood, what do you make of General Clapper's characterization of the Ikhwan as a largely secular group that has eschewed violence and considers Al-Qaeda a perversion of Islam? or his claim that the Brotherhood has no overarching agenda, particularly in pursuit of violence, at least internationally. It's hard to overstate the significance of what is, as this course makes clear, so grievously wrong and seriously misleading a characterization of the Muslim Brotherhood by the top intelligence officer of the United States government. General Clapper subsequently tried to walk back his statement, suggesting he had been misunderstood, but the Director of National Intelligence didn't misspeak. Neither was there any confusion about what he was saying. In fact, he appeared to be reading from prepared notes, which would mean that his depiction of the Muslim Brotherhood as basically a benign organization reflected considered judgment, either his or that of his intelligence community. No one listening to him on Capitol Hill could have been confused as to what he meant. In light of the high stakes we've discussed elsewhere in this course, two questions occur to which Americans are entitled to have urgent answers. First, to what extent have policy or perhaps political directions shaped such defective intelligence? And second, to what extent is that flawed intelligence assessment now driving or at least helping internally to justify the Obama administration's dangerous policy of engaging the Muslim Brotherhood abroad and at home? Let's see how such policies are being promulgated in various agencies of the U.S. government. Let's turn next to the Obama Department of State under Secretary Hillary Clinton. The State Department has, of course, not simply been a venue for iftar dinners with Secretary Clinton. It has been at the forefront of implementing President Obama's pro-Islamist program. In addition to the previously noted role Mrs. Clinton personally played in engaging the Muslim Brotherhood in June 2010, four examples attest to the damage being done by the State Department under her leadership and that of Huma Abedin. As we've seen, the Muslim Brotherhood and its Islamist allies have long recognized the importance of information dominance. They've exploited wherever possible Sharia's prohibition on blasphemy as a pretext for asserting that nothing offensive can be expressed about Islam, its God, prophet, or followers. This has been a particular priority of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, or OIC, under its Secretary General Ihsanoglu. According to its charter, the mission of the OIC is to, quote, disseminate, promote, and preserve the Islamic teachings and values based on moderation and tolerance, promote Islamic culture, and safeguard Islamic heritage, unquote, and, quote, to endeavor to work for revitalizing Islam's pioneering role in the world, unquote. Since it published its 10-year plan in 2004, the OIC has used its 57 members' clout in the United Nations and its subsidiary organizations like the Human Rights Council to advance this agenda. It has repeatedly introduced resolutions calling on UN member nations to prohibit and criminalize expression that, quote, defames, unquote, Islam. Under President Obama, the United States actually joined as a co-sponsor of a version of the OIC defamation resolution in 2009. Afterwards, Western nations began recoiling from the clear affront to freedom of speech and other civil liberties inherent in the OIC initiative. Secretary Clinton, however, held a series of meetings with the OIC's Ihsanoglu to bridge such differences. One such meeting occurred in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia in February 2010. As it happens, this was the same 2010 trip to Jeddah where Mrs. Clinton sang the praises of her Deputy Chief of Staff, Huma Abedin, at the university there founded by her mother, a prominent member of the Muslim Sisterhood. Beginning in July 2011, these conversations were formalized and made half-yearly affairs dubbed the Istanbul process for the Turkish city in which she met that month with Ihsanoglu. As the brilliant author and historian David Price Jones observed in March 2012, quote, the Istanbul process is evidently the latest attempt to censure truth-telling as un-Islamic and so prohibit it. Westerners should have nothing to do with it, unquote. Unfortunately, Secretary Clinton has ignored such wise counsel and used the second meeting of the Istanbul process in Washington in December 2011 to make a redoubled effort to accommodate the OIC's demands. In Washington, Clinton agreed to language that shifts the focus from defamation of religion to incitement. Specifically, Secretary Clinton and the OIC agreed that, quote, any advocacy of hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence shall be prohibited by law, unquote. Of course, like hate crime statutes, the language affirmed by the Obama State Department can threaten our First Amendment freedoms and presumes to be able to tell what is in a person's heart and mind. What is more, the meaning of incitement is left up to the Obama administration and the OIC, an organization dedicated to safeguarding Islamic heritage. According to this agreed language, any discussion or serious study of Islamism and Sharia, for example, this course, could constitute such incitement and be a criminal offense. U.S. officials pushed the line that a great breakthrough had been achieved by finessing the OIC's defamation gambit and the threat it represents to American constitutional freedoms. But the OIC's Ihsanoglu says this agreement is not, quote, the end of the road, unquote, and a meeting in Europe will afford a chance to move down it in July 2012. The Obama administration has also continued an initiative begun in the latter years of the George W. Bush presidency of granting disproportionate numbers of refugee admission authorizations to people from predominantly Muslim-populated regions. Here's a breakdown of in-country refugee admissions into the United States for fiscal year 2012, based on an Obama presidential memorandum to the Secretary of State. As we can see, more than 46% of all those accorded this status in fiscal year 2012 are expected to come from the Near East or South Asia alone. Those emigrating from other regions, notably Africans from Somalia, are also Muslims. This arrangement substantially reflects the dictates of the international arbiter of what groups should be deemed to be asylum-worthy, namely the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Given the Organization of Islamic Cooperation's preeminent role in the UN, it should come as no surprise that populations receiving that designation, and admitted here pursuant to it, are more often of the Muslim faith than any other. Under a program administered by the Department of Health and Human Services, a deeply problematic migration has occurred, often in relatively rural and underpopulated areas of the United States. For example, states like Maine, Minnesota, and Tennessee, with relatively generous social safety nets. There are numerous difficulties associated with bringing these populations to America. For one, few of these refugees are equipped to find employment. They typically require extensive social services, a fact that even the Obama administration has acknowledged. Such populations severely tax the ability of local communities and states to meet their needs. Despite the huge sums the federal government pays to a kind of cottage industry of support organizations that have enriched themselves in the process of insinuating these refugees here, there are impacts that are not being mitigated. The most serious problem arises from the fact that these Muslim refugees typically are Sharia adherent and either unwilling, or at least as a practical matter, unable to assimilate. Over time, if not from the get-go, such refugee populations tend to form what amount to Sharia-adherent ghettos. If the European experience is any guide, in due course, these evolve into no-go zones where law enforcement and other authorities ultimately dare not enter. Well before such a stage is reached, these populations can profoundly affect the socio-economic and political character of the host community. For example, the largest Somali population in the world outside of Somalia is in Minnesota. It's estimated to have grown there over the past 5 years from 2% of the state's population to roughly 16%. That demographic shift has contributed to the election of the nation's first Muslim congressman, Representative Keith Ellison, a legislator who is closely tied to the Muslim Brotherhood's American fronts and an accomplished practitioner of taqiyya in his own right. Listen to an example of Mr. Ellison's taqiyya in this exchange with comedian Bill Maher in March 2011.
As a student of religion, you know, their books are complex, they're compiled, and taking them out of context is a very easy thing to do.
I've heard this many times, and I don't buy it. I'm sorry. Well, Sam Harris says on almost every page the Quran instructs observant Muslims to despise non-believers.
That's absurd, ridiculous,
and he quotes it.
It's
Am I getting the wrong translation? Because that's what every Muslim always tells me.
No,
Really?
you must be. I would recommend...
A lot of bad translations then.
Well, why don't you read the part where it says that anyone who takes a life is as if he killed the whole world, and anyone who saves a life is as if he saved the whole world. What about the one where it says that there be no compulsion in religion, and that it's literally wrong?
Well, then where are the terrorists getting their instructions from? They're getting it from something else.
Like any ideologue, they will take things out of context to do what they want to do. If you listen to terrorist rhetoric, Bill, what they do is they cite politics. They cite political grievances. They don't really use too much religion. As a matter of fact, when you find Muslims who reject terrorism, as I do and almost everyone does, it often is for spiritual and religious reasons and moral reasons. But when people want to justify it, they justify it on political reasons. This is well documented. Check out the Gallup poll. Check out people who've studied this stuff. One of the things that I think we can do to undermine terrorist ideology is actually to use people who know the Quran and to go after people like Anwar al-Awlaki who misquote it, misuse it, and don't really understand it.
On this point, at least, Bill Maher is correct. Representative Ellison engages in a classic bit of Islamist deflection, doing exactly what he is accusing others of doing. He engages in cherry-picking passages from the Quran. His transparent purpose is to distort its plain meaning, or, at a minimum, to obscure what mainstream Islam interprets Allah's direction to be, pursuant to Sharia. For example, Mr. Ellison cites a favorite passage of those who use taqiyya to mislead would-be interfaith bridge builders, prospective converts, and other non-Muslims. Surah 2:256. Quote, "There is no compulsion in religion," unquote. He didn't mention, however, that such guidance has been authoritatively deemed to have been abrogated, replaced by subsequent divine revelations that require faithful Muslims to compel others to convert to Islam, submit to it, or die. Another serious problem is that the Sharia enforcing character of these enclaves makes them incubating and recruiting grounds for jihad. That danger is only increased by the fact that, according to the State Department's own data, as many as 80% of the Somalis in this country are here illegally, having taken advantage of the refugee program to make fraudulent claims of family ties. The inadvisability of such a practice with respect to Muslims is all the more evident when contrasted with the treatment accorded Christians anxious to start new lives and assimilate in America if they can only escape from their native lands in the Near East, South Asia, and other regions. In Muslim-majority countries where Sharia is enforced, Christians are considered second-class citizens at best. They face state-sanctioned persecution, ranging from limits to their participation in society to genocide. Like the OIC, the Obama State Department has little use for these populations and has done little to ameliorate their plight in or their exit from places like Egypt, Iraq, and Sudan. Yet another in this series of concessions and favorable treatment given to the Muslim Brotherhood is the State Department's clearance of the way for Brotherhood operatives to obtain visas to enter the United States. Hillary Clinton personally intervened on January 20th, 2010, to overturn the George W. Bush administration practice of blocking a U.S. visa for Tariq Ramadan on the grounds that he qualified, under the Patriot Act's authority, to be denied travel papers to foreigners who use, quote, "a position of prominence within any country to endorse or espouse terrorist activity," unquote. The administration's decision is instructive, since Ramadan is, like Suhail Khan, what the Communist Chinese would call a princeling of the Muslim Brotherhood by virtue of his being the grandson of its founder, Hassan al-Banna. Unlike his grandfather, who the Eisenhower State Department identified as an Islamic fascist, Ramadan is a slick advocate of Islamist causes in the West, skilled at obscuring his jihadism behind a smokescreen of lying for the faith, or taqiyya. In particular, Ramadan has mastered using the postmodern language of the left to rationalize the use of Sharia in government. Even the fact that the U.S. government had previously found that Tariq Ramadan had provided material support to a designated terrorist group, Hamas, was not deemed an impediment to Hillary Clinton clearing the way for him to receive a visa. He has subsequently been feted at George Soros's Center for American Progress and countless forums of the far left, and of course, within Muslim Brotherhood-dominated communities in America. Speaking of reckless visa granting, in March 2012, Mrs. Clinton's department reportedly ordered that other Muslim Brotherhood operatives seeking admission to the United States be allowed to do so as well. Knowing what we do now about these civilization jihadists, the idea of permitting them to come to this country in still larger numbers and to abet the efforts of those already here can only be described as irresponsibly reckless. In addition, on March 22, 2012, Mrs. Clinton personally exercised a national security waiver to legislation that restricted further U.S. foreign military aid to Egypt, now that it is under the control of the Muslim Brotherhood, despite evidence that the new government is undermining the peace treaty with Israel and progress towards genuine democracy. Indeed, immediately after the Clinton waiver, secular politicians in Egypt refused to participate in the new parliament's constitution writing initiative on the grounds that it was completely dominated by Muslim Brothers and other Salafists, determined to impose Sharia. The Justice Department is the next stop on this inside look at key government agencies. The extent of President Obama's pro-Islamist program is, if anything, even more in evidence at the Department of Justice under Attorney General Eric Holder. Let's see why that's so by considering what has been happening there since January 2009. First, there's Holder's use of the Justice Department to credential and embrace a host of Muslim Brotherhood-tied groups as the very community liaisons so important to the Obama countering violent extremism strategy. Even before President Obama enunciated his national strategy for empowering local partners in countering violent extremism, the Holder Justice Department was deeply engaged with the sorts of Islamists who appear to have helped shape and certainly are benefiting from its approach to community partnership. The Attorney General has in Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights Thomas Perez an enthusiastic helpmate on outreach to all the wrong sorts of Muslim community leaders. Perez is among the most ideologically rigid members of the Obama administration with a background in the hard left. He was a former staffer to the late Senator Kennedy and was a Democratic county councilman in Maryland. Most troubling, however, is Perez's association with the radical Casa de Maryland, which he served as president. That organization, also funded by George Soros, is an aggressive advocacy group whose mission is to protect illegal aliens against the enforcement of U.S. immigration laws. Casa de Maryland has even distributed a pamphlet explaining to such aliens how they can avoid being caught. Such a pedigree would normally preclude an individual from serving in U.S. law enforcement. In the Obama administration, however, it is a ticket to a top policy-making position in what has been called the most politicized Justice Department in memory. Consider three groups the Department of Justice has relied upon as liaisons to Muslim Americans. Apparently, one of the most important of these is the Muslim Public Affairs Council, or MPAC. In August 2010, the online trade publication mainjustice.com reported, quote, "The Muslim community has taken proactive steps to stop the recruitment of terrorists," Holder said, such as a video made by a group of American Muslims that repudiates the tactics used by radical terrorists to recruit young followers online. That video was produced by the Muslim Public Affairs Council, which has taken on a prominent liaison role at the Department of Justice and the FBI. Unquote. According to that same August 2010 report, Main Justice described how, quote, MPAC, formed in 1988, has seen its star rise somewhat as the Council on American Islamic Relations has fallen. Last month, MPAC hosted Assistant Attorney General Thomas Perez at the group's 9th annual convention in Los Angeles. In a keynote speech, the Civil Rights Division's chief struck MPAC's policy themes, saying that racial profiling is, quote, not just bad as a matter of civil rights, it is ineffective police work, unquote. So, it must be asked, what exactly is the Muslim Public Affairs Council that the Justice Department is said to be increasingly using as a liaison and resource, and whose themes a top policymaker there is sounding? Unfortunately, like nearly all the prominent Muslim American organizations, and particularly those the Obama administration deals with, MPAC has, from its inception, had myriad ties to the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamists. Leading counterterrorism expert Stephen Emerson's investigative project on terrorism documents these ties and MPAC's service to the Islamist agenda in an investigative report entitled, quote, Behind the Facade, the Muslim Public Affairs Council, unquote. In light of the damning evidence compiled in this dossier, it is staggering to think how deeply inside the wire this front group is in the Justice Department and elsewhere in the U.S. government. Reportedly, another favorite interlocutor for the Obama-Holder Perez team at the Department of Justice is a group calling itself Muslim Advocates. Farhana Kara is the principal public face of Muslim Advocates, and a sister organization she also leads called the National Association of Muslim Lawyers. She formerly worked for Senator Russ Feingold of Wisconsin as a counsel to the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee. For the purpose of calibrating this organization's affinity for the Islamist agenda, considering what appear to be its standing priorities, promoting a sense of Muslim victimhood, discouraging Muslim cooperation with the FBI, defending jihadists, and engaging in taqiyya about the threat emanating from within the Muslim community. Two of Muslim Advocates' most recent focuses have been on harassing the New York Police Department over its counterterrorism operations and strengthening Muslim charities by, among other things, ending impediments to material support for terrorism in the guise of zakat. It's hard to believe that career professionals in the Department of Justice, FBI, and law enforcement more generally would regard a group with these attributes as a desirable liaison to American Muslims. A further insight into the true orientation of Muslim Advocates is the fact that a member of its board of directors is LaDale K. George, who was, as we learned in Part 7, a former partner in the Chicago office of Foley Lardner, the law firm of Grover Norquist and Suhail Khan's advocate, Cleta Mitchell. The Muslim Advocates website describes him as, quote, legal counsel to the Islamic Society of North America, unquote. He is also identified as, quote, a member of the executive committee of the Council of Islamic Organizations of Greater Chicago, unquote. Both groups have extensive ties to the Muslim Brotherhood. Not only is LaDale George tied to the Islamic Society of North America, so is the Obama-Holder Perez Department of Justice. For example, Attorney General Holder declined to continue the practice of his predecessor, Alberto Gonzales, who on June 27, 2007, canceled a speech rather than be in the room with the leader of an unindicted co-conspirator, like ISNA's Mohammed Majid. Instead, on September 7, 2010, Mr. Holder actually held a meeting with a group of Islamists that included both Majid and then ISNA President Ingrid Mattson. For his part, Assistant Attorney General Tom Perez has been even more publicly demonstrative of his high regard for one of America's top Muslim brothers. As we learned in Part 8 of this course, he actually leapt onto a stage at George Washington Law School in October 2011 and hugged Imam Majid. The Attorney General has not only met with unindicted co-conspirators, he has reportedly blocked requests for their prosecution as a second phase of the Holy Land Foundation trial. Mr. Holder's decision prompted a strongly worded letter from House Homeland Security Committee Chairman Peter King dated April 15, 2011. It challenged, quote, your decision not to prosecute the 246 individuals and organizations named as unindicted co-conspirators in a Hamas terror finance case, United States versus Holy Land Foundation, unquote. Representative King added, quote, I have been reliably informed that the decision not to seek indictments of the Council on American Islamic Relations and its co-founder Omar Ahmed, the Islamic Society of North America, and the North American Islamic Trust was usurped by high-ranking officials at Department of Justice headquarters over the vehement and stated objections of special agents and supervisors of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, as well as the prosecutors at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Dallas who had investigated and successfully prosecuted the Holy Land Foundation case. Their opposition to this decision raises serious doubt that the decision not to prosecute was a valid exercise of prosecutorial discretion, unquote. Another example of the president's pro-Islamist policy manifesting itself in practical and problematic ways at the Justice Department can be seen in the activities of its Civil Rights Division under Assistant Attorney General Thomas Perez. The division's page at the DOJ website makes clear that under Thomas Perez, the division, quote, has placed a priority on prosecuting bias crimes and incidents of discrimination against Muslims, Sikhs, and persons of Arab and South Asian descent, as well as persons perceived to be members of these groups. The division also has engaged in extensive outreach efforts to these communities to educate people about their rights and available government services." Unquote. An example of the Civil Rights Division's translating this priority into action occurred in December 2010 when the Justice Department sued a suburban Chicago school system on behalf of Sufura Khan, a first-year middle school teacher who sought 3 weeks off during exams to make the Muslim pilgrimage to Mecca. The school district wound up agreeing to pay her $75,000. Former Attorney General Michael Mukasey said of this intervention, quote, "It sounds like a very dubious judgment and a real legal reach," unquote. But Assistant Attorney General Thomas Perez explained Justice's involvement, saying, quote, "This was a profoundly personal request by a person of faith," unquote, comparing the case to protecting, quote, "the religious liberty that our forefathers came to this country for," unquote. It's bad enough that President Obama and Attorney General Holder have placed Thomas Perez, the former leader of an organization enabling the violation of immigration laws, at the helm of the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division. They've also entrusted senior DOJ positions with responsibility for policymaking on counterterrorism and terrorist detainees to lawyers who have been involved with representing some of our most dangerous jihadist enemies. J. Christian Adams, a former civil service attorney in the Civil Rights Division under Eric Holder, asked the right questions about the placement of many individuals who either personally worked on behalf of jihadists detained at Guantanamo Bay or who worked with other lawyers who did. For example, Mr. Adams wrote, quote, "Should lawyers who represented America's terrorist enemies be allowed anywhere close to government jobs that set terrorist policies?" Unquote, and quote, "Why shouldn't representing the mortal enemies of America ultimately disqualify you from serving as counsel for the United States, especially counsel over terrorist policy?" Unquote. As noted previously, President Obama's National Countering Violent Extremism Strategy and its implementation plan confers on U.S. attorneys responsibility for empowering local partners and deciding which ones to engage. While investing such authority with prosecutors has a certain initial appeal, the fact that such officials serve at the pleasure of the president and often are politically ambitious individuals suggests they may be less than objective in the face of strong direction from their leadership in ways that are, objectively, antithetical to sound law enforcement and national security practices, to say nothing of common sense. Such concerns were only reinforced by the comments made in an official capacity by one U.S. attorney, Dwight Holton of Oregon, at the George Washington Law School event in October 2011, where Assistant Attorney General Tom Perez embraced Mohammed Majid. Mr. Holton declared that there would be a complete ban on FBI training materials that link Islam to violence in any way. He said, quote, "I want to be perfectly clear about this. Training materials that portray Islam as a religion of violence or with a tendency towards violence are wrong. They are offensive, and they are contrary to everything this President, this Attorney General, and Department of Justice stands for. They will not be tolerated." Unquote. If that is the guidance every U.S. attorney is operating under, we confront something worse than our enemy's information dominance. We are engaging in wholesale submission to Sharia. U.S. Attorney Holton's message is not the only indication of the serious problems afflicting the FBI and the country, thanks to President Obama's pro-Islamist policies. 3 examples warrant particular attention. Under both the previous administration and most especially the present one, the FBI's management has scrupulously conformed to political direction to embrace what amount to Muslim Brotherhood organizations, in the name of political correctness, sensitivity, diversity, or other euphemisms for submission. The Bureau has adopted, as a result, at the highest levels, practices and procedures that have effectively ceded information dominance to the enemy. As we've discussed repeatedly in this course, such a posture disables an understanding of the threat and the ability effectively to counter it. That is true in spades with the FBI, given its vital role in Homeland Security. For lower-level FBI personnel, deviating from such submission is a career-threatening offense. Attorney General guidelines governing domestic investigations initially promulgated in December 2008 and subsequently revised, have made matters considerably worse. Also known as Domestic Investigative Operational Guidelines, or DIOG, these directives have had the practical effect of barring the FBI from investigating suspicious activities before there's evidence that would rise to the standard of probable cause to believe criminal activity is underway. As a result, the Bureau has had to rely increasingly on state and local law enforcement agencies to perform these functions. Not surprisingly, having made great strides at neutralizing the FBI, the Islamists are now turning their sights on other law enforcement organizations that are not directly subject to the Attorney General's guidelines on domestic investigations and therefore remain capable of performing effective counterterrorism operations. Chief among these is the New York Police Department under Commissioner Ray Kelly. In 2011 and 2012, the NYPD has been subjected to particularly intense and sustained attacks from Muslim Brotherhood fronts like the Council on American Islamic Relations and Muslim advocates and their enablers, including the Associated Press. The possibility that we are witnessing a wholesale submission to Sharia appears all the more real in light of a meeting convened by the director of the FBI, Robert Mueller, on February 12, 2012. As was noted in Part 8 of this course, among the invitees was ISNA's Mohammed Majid and representatives of several other Muslim Brotherhood fronts and allies. On that occasion, Director Robert Mueller engaged in what can only be described as an act of capitulation to the Islamists' Sharia blasphemy dictates. It also violated explicit direction from congressional appropriators that such meetings between the FBI and unindicted co-conspirators are not to occur. To recap what we've already covered, in the fall of 2011, Wired magazine's Spencer Ackerman reported about anti-Muslim training materials shortly after Homeland Security Advisory Council member Mohammed El-Biari visited the FBI Academy at Quantico. Sensing an opportunity to seize new and perhaps decisive ground in their campaign to establish absolute information dominance over the U.S. government, CAIR, ISNA, and other Brotherhood fronts immediately professed outrage and demanded corrective action. As usual, the fellow traveling left and elite media provided an amplifying echo chamber. In response to this outcry from Brotherhood influence operators and their allies, Attorney General Holder denounced the materials. In groveling testimony before Senator Dick Durbin, Democrat of Illinois and a longtime ally of and apologist for Islamist front groups, Mr. Holder condemned such materials as wrong and declared that, quote, they really have a negative impact on our ability to communicate effectively, unquote, with American Muslims. Mr. Holder not only went to great lengths to abase himself and his subordinates for this grievous error, he promised Senator Durbin and his colleagues that the Justice Department and the FBI were reviewing their training materials and had distanced themselves from an unnamed FBI trainer that had developed and used them. Unsurprisingly, Director Mueller's guests were not satisfied with his announcement that 700 such documents and 300 briefings had been purged. After all, their Sharia doctrine commands that, in the face of evidence of the enemy's submission, they must redouble the effort, as the Quran puts it, to make the unbelievers, quote, feel subdued, unquote. Consequently, according to their joint press release issued after the meeting, the assembled brothers and their friends wanted to be sure that they would have a say in new training materials and conduct such training. They also sought future opportunities to meet with Director Mueller and thereby to bring continued pressure to bear on the FBI. It appears they will get both. In late March 2012, the Bureau released what it called, quote, the FBI's Guiding Principles, touchstone document on training, unquote. The first sentence of this product establishes the priority for counterterrorism training. Quote, FBI training must emphasize the protection of civil rights and civil liberties, unquote. The guidance goes on to require training to respect the difference between, quote, constitutionally protected statements and activities designed to achieve political, social, or other objectives, and violent extremism, unquote. The latter is defined as, quote, the use, threatened use, or advocacy of use of force or violence when directed at and likely to incite imminent lawless activity, unquote. The practical effect of such guidance is to ensure that the personnel who constitute the nation's front line of defense against the enemy within are trained to ignore seditious statements and activities unless they constitute incitement to imminent violent or other lawless activity. This civil rights über alles approach may reflect exceedingly restrictive pronouncements of the Supreme Court in cases like Brandenburg versus Ohio, but it ensures that law enforcement will be blind to the danger posed by pre-violent civilization jihadists pursuing a phased plan for our destruction from within prior to the phase where, quote, seizing the government, unquote, is imminent. Particularly worrying is the following guidance. Quote, mere association with organizations that demonstrate both legitimate advocacy and illicit violent extremism objectives should not automatically result in a determination that the associated individual is acting in furtherance of the organization's illicit objectives, unquote. This formulation would appear to clear the way for, if not actually require, the Bureau to engage with individuals like Hamas fundraiser Kifa Mustafa, Hamas political operative and CARE executive director Niad Awad, Palestinian Islamic Jihad leader Sami al-Arian, and Muslim Brother and ISNA president Mohammed Majid. Such direction was precipitated by another set of guiding principles promulgated on March 20, 2012 by Eric Holder's controversial deputy, James Cole. In a letter to the department's various components and U.S. attorneys, Cole required that, quote, all training conducted or funded by the Department of Justice, unquote, be consistent with guidelines unanimously recommended by, quote, a working group on training issues chaired by the Civil Rights Division that was constituted within the Attorney General's Arab-Muslim Engagement Advisory Group and included representatives from each relevant component and U.S. Attorney's Office. It's not clear at the moment precisely who is on the Attorney General's Arab-Muslim Engagement Advisory Group, but given prominent roles we've seen the Obama-Holder-Perez Justice Department accord the likes of MPAC, Muslim Advocates, and ISNA, it certainly would not be surprising if such Muslim Brotherhood-tied organizations are represented on this group too. And it certainly is no surprise that the upshot of engagement with such organizations is a further codification of their information dominance over the United States government. Just how complete that dominance is can be seen in this exchange between the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, Representative Lamar Smith of Texas, and Attorney General Holder on May 13, 2011.
In the case of all three attempts in the last year, the terrorist attempts, one of which was successful, those individuals have had ties to radical Islam. Do you feel that these individuals might have been incited to take the actions that they did because of radical Islam?
Because of?
Radical Islam.
There are a variety of reasons why I think people have taken these actions. It's hard, one, I think you have to look at each individual case. I mean, we're in the process now of talking to Mr. Shahzad to try to understand what it is that drove him to take the action he took.
But radical Islam could have been one of the reasons?
There are a variety of reasons why people...
But was radical Islam one of them?
There are a variety of reasons why people do these things. Some of them are potentially religious based.
But all I'm asking is if you think among those variety of reasons, radical Islam might have been one of the reasons that the individuals took the steps that they did.
We see, say, radical Islam. I mean, I think those people who espouse a version of Islam that is not...
Are you uncomfortable attributing any of their actions to radical Islam? It sounds like
No, I don't want to say anything negative about a religion that is not appropriate.
I'm not talking about a religion.
Like
I'm talking about radical Islam. I'm not talking about the general religion.
Right, and I'm saying that a person like Anwar Alaki, for instance, who has a version of Islam that is not consistent with the teachings of it, and who espouses a radical version.
Could radical Islam have motivated these individuals to take the steps that they did?
I certainly think that it's possible that people who espouse a radical version of Islam have had an ability to have an impact on people like Mr. Shahzad.
Okay, and could it have been the case in one of these three instances?
Could that have been the case?
Yeah, could one of these three individuals have been incited by radical Islam? Apparently you feel that they could have been.
Well, I think potentially incited by of Islam that is inconsistent with the
Mr. A.G., it's hard to get an answer yes or no. But
One might be inclined to believe that things couldn't possibly be as bad at the Defense Department as we've seen is the case with the intelligence community, the State Department, and the Department of Justice. Unfortunately, the Pentagon has been in the unenviable position of being where, as they say in the military, the rubber meets the road. Starting with President Bush and to an even greater extent in the Obama administration, the effects have been much in evidence of ceding information dominance to the enemy and myriad defective policies that have flowed from not knowing who they are or what animates them. They have contributed greatly to needless loss of lives. They've caused the squandering of immense resources, and most importantly, they've ensured that we will be denied victory. Let's consider 4 areas where such impacts are manifest. The Defense Department has exemplified the U.S. government's failure to know the enemy. This is not an accident. It reflects what federal prosecutor turned author, commentator, Andrew McCarthy calls the willful blindness emanating from the White House as well as forces at work within the military itself. A prime example of willful blindness inside the Pentagon occurred in January 2008, and its repercussions continue to be felt to this day. Stephen Coughlin, one of the country's preeminent non-Muslim experts on Sharia, was removed as an advisor to the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the instigation of a well-placed former naval officer, Hisham Islam, Muslim outreach coordinator for then-Deputy Defense Secretary Gordon England. At issue were Coughlin's warnings about the Muslim Brotherhood front that Islam was using as the Pentagon's liaison to Muslim Americans, the Islamic Society of North America. As award-winning investigative journalist Claudia Rosette pointed out at the time, Hisham Islam had engaged his boss deeply in dealings with ISNA, a practice that, as we have seen, continues. Interestingly, Ms. Rosette was unable to confirm details of Islam's official biography, as posted at the time at the Defense Department website. When she posed sharp questions to the Pentagon about the evident inconsistencies, it responded by removing Islam's bio. As we've seen elsewhere in this course, another practice begun in previous administrations remains a serious problem for the Pentagon today. The Defense Department has utilized a succession of Islamists, including prominent Muslim brothers, to recruit, train, and credential chaplains for the U.S. military. After Abdurrahman al-Amoudi went to jail, this function was given to officials and subsidiaries of the Islamic Society of North America, currently headed by Mohammed Majid. As we've seen, one of those officials, ISNA Vice President Louis Safi, was also involved in training U.S. troops on matters of cultural sensitivity about Islam prior to their deployments to combat theaters overseas. Having such Muslims in the ranks can only further compound the confusion about who the enemy is and how to counter his ideology and strategy, let alone his tactics. It also opens the door to further Islamist recruitment and radicalization, or dawah, within the armed forces. In a November 10, 2004 document entitled, quote, Evaluation Report on the DoD Chaplain Program, unquote, the Pentagon's then Inspector General, Joseph Schmitz, recommended the adoption of non-religious criteria that would allow, quote, the withdrawal or removal of a religious organization or its agent from participating in the Defense Department's chaplain program, unquote. He suggested that such criteria could include advocating the violent overthrow of the U.S. government, being listed on a watch list as a terrorist organization, and other common-sense standards. In the absence of such changes, even chaplains trained by an al-Qaeda operative like Abdurrahman al-Amoudi can continue to be at large in the U.S. Armed Forces. Indeed, that would appear to be the case today. Almost 6 years to the day after the 2004 IG's evaluation report was issued, Joseph Schmitz, by then a private citizen and member of the Team B2 group that authored Sharia: The Threat to America, felt obliged to write Senator Dianne Feinstein, chairwoman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, urging congressional oversight and action on his recommendations. He noted that in the after-action report on the Fort Hood massacre, an independent blue ribbon panel had concluded that, quote, to protect our force, our leaders need immediate access to information pertaining to service member contacts, connections, or relationships with organizations promoting violence," unquote. Unfortunately, there appears still to have been no corrective action taken. Here's how the former Inspector General characterizes the situation today.
While I was serving as Inspector General of the Department of Defense in 2003, Senator Schumer of New York brought to my attention a number of sensitive concerns about Muslim chaplains, and I had to come over to the Senate, get briefed in the Intelligence Committee, SCIF, by the chairman and by Senator Kyle, and went back, ultimately did a review of military chaplains to make sure that we were doing what was necessary and proper. One of my recommendations, because of the knowledge I had of potential criminal complicity between certain chaplain-endorsing agents and Hamas, was that we should just check with the FBI before we put our faith and confidence. I made that recommendation, and it was rejected by lawyers in the Pentagon. And in fact, it was formally rejected on the excuse that, or the rationale that the DoD would continue to rely on the Internal Revenue Service for the bona fides of religious organizations. And that, frankly, didn't sit well with me, but that's what you do sometimes. You make recommendations, they get accepted or they get rejected. But as soon as Nidal Hassan killed 13 Americans at Fort Hood, that was the first thing that came to my mind, is that, you know, the cowardly lawyers in the Pentagon who thought somehow that they were going to be pushing the limit on the First Amendment by simply checking with the FBI to make sure that our chaplain-endorsing agencies weren't complicit with criminal activity. Well, since Fort Hood, I actually felt compelled to go back to Chairman Feinstein and raise the fact that the Pentagon had rejected my recommendation to check with the FBI, because frankly I think that the Nidal Hassan incident, which is tragic as it was, it could have been avoided had people simply been a little bit more courageous to identify red flags and report them when they see them. And in fact, I've written a book about the IG profession, and one of my chapter titles is "Can Chaplains Be Moles for Al-Qaeda?" And it's obviously a rhetorical question, because they can, and we have had incidents involving chaplains where it is simply not good enough to say it's a First Amendment issue and we can't touch it. We cannot turn our blind eye to those type of red flags. It's just something that Americans should never do.
Speaking of the Fort Hood massacre, even when, to paraphrase its independent investigation, our leaders have access to information about service member contacts, connections, or relationships with organizations promoting violence, the U.S. military has been rendered, most especially under President Obama, utterly incapable of protecting our force. In the face of abundant evidence of Major Hassan's adherence to Sharia, which he warned compelled him to kill infidels poised to harm his co-religionists, no one prevented him from counseling returning battle-scarred servicemen. No one kept him from getting promoted. No one kept him from being sent to war. And no one thought it inadvisable for him to be the lay imam for other Muslims in the Fort Hood community. The extent to which the Defense Department is in denial about the nature of the enemy is captured in two official comments. Within days of the massacre at Fort Hood, the Army Chief of Staff at the time, General George Casey, declared that it would be an even greater tragedy than the loss of more than a dozen Americans if, quote, diversity becomes a casualty, unquote. And in December 2011, the Pentagon sent Congress a letter describing the massacre at Fort Hood as an incident of, quote, workplace violence, unquote, in line with the Council on American Islamic Relations and other Islamists' line that the incident had, quote, nothing to do with Islam, unquote. Like many other Americans, key members of Congress took vehement exception to this particularly appalling demonstration of Team Obama's willful blindness regarding the enemy. As Congressman Mike Kaufman, himself a decorated combat veteran of both the United States Army and Marine Corps, put it in a letter to the Defense Department on December 7, 2011, quote, just as the United States had previously recognized that it was in an ideological war with Marxist communism, Now it must come to terms with accurately describing the current threat to our national security, radical Islam. Unfortunately, our military, constrained by the Obama administration, has yet to do so, for fear that it might offend the loyal adherents to the virtues of political correctness that has led this administration to change global war on terror to overseas contingency operations and terrorists' attacks to man-caused disasters. I strongly believe that the failure to classify radical Islam as an ideological threat to the United States led to the loss of 13 American soldiers at Fort Hood." Unquote. Unfortunately, as we've seen throughout this course, what is at work here is not simply a matter of political correctness, or, for that matter, of diversity, or cultural sensitivity. In the eyes of our enemies, at least, it is submission to the will of Allah as interpreted and codified in Sharia. Here's an example of how the enemy extracts such submission from, among others, the U.S. military. The interview occurred against the backdrop of the active jihad against service personnel at Specialist Clowan's base, Fort Hood, less than a year before. This statement, and comments to the effect that his training was, quote, "a slap in the face," unquote, and, quote, "propaganda against Islam," unquote, were made by a Muslim U.S. Army soldier in uniform on what amounts to the Islamists' preeminent propaganda vehicle, Al Jazeera television. Specialist Clowan's interview reeks of victimhood and is seen as the sort of complaint of Islamophobic mistreatment, or, for the Muslim Brotherhood, a call for defensive jihad that can be used as a pretext for further violence against troops in the field and other American targets. The predictable response is for military commanders to redouble the effort to appease the easily offended Islamists. The official response to the Clowan interview was, well, accommodating. For instance, an Army spokesman at Fort Hood seemed to suggest that such acts of incitement by soldiers in uniform would be unobjectionable as long as the chain of command is informed in advance. The real point is the effort made to bend over backwards rather than give offense to Specialist Clowan's co-religionists. The spokesman even spun the soldiers' activities as a kind of plus, saying, quote, "He's been working directly with our Spiritual Fitness Center. There's been quite a bit of movement in terms of movement in the Muslim community in a very positive way," unquote. This episode is but a microcosm of the larger practice by the U.S. Armed Forces since 9/11, and most especially under the Obama administration. Syndicated columnist Diana West has documented the phenomenon she calls the dimmification of the military, a reference to the inferior status of and submissive behavior expected of dhimmis, or Christians or Jews, in Muslim societies. Dhimmis may be tolerated, provided they conform to repressive rules governing their religious and other conduct, and pay the jizya, a tax on infidels. The symbolic import of these illustrative examples of dhimmifying the American military in connection with the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq are self-evident. Let's examine, though, several that warrant a few words of amplification. In response to the accidental burning of defaced Qurans in Afghanistan, the Pentagon promulgated new guidelines with respect to, quote, cultural sensitivity, unquote, and required that, quote, all on-site personnel, unquote, had to be trained about them by March 10th, 2012. Two representative slides from this training make clear the submission of U.S. personnel to Sharia, even to the point of subordinating search and destroy operations to the need to treat the Quran deferentially. This slide makes clear that henceforth anything that Muslims hold sacred will be treated as such by U.S. personnel. What do we think the Islamists in Afghanistan and elsewhere are making of our behavior? Start with the serial, abject apologies from the U.S. Commander-in-Chief, the Commanding General in theater, and military and civilian officials on down the Defense Department food chain. Then there have been the untold instances where What amounts to blood money has been paid for civilians killed and wounded. Throw in a raft of other assiduous efforts to keep from offending adherents to Islam, and the message is clear, at least to our foes. The supremacy of Sharia is being recognized by the dhimmi Americans. Another piece of evidence supporting this conclusion on the part of our Islamist foes has been the well-intentioned but submissive-seeming practice of having U.S. military personnel oversee or fund construction or repairing of mosques in theater. For example, as reported in this news article distributed by the Pentagon, a Marine captain is described as having served as the project manager for the rebuilding of a, quote, crumbling ruin in the secluded village of Khan Nashin in Afghanistan, unquote, allowing it to serve as, quote, the centerpiece of the local government, unquote. Unfortunately, from Muhammad's time onwards, mosques have served as much more than just houses of worship. As author and scholar of Islamism Dr. Andrew Bostom observed in June 2011, there is a tradition in Islamist circles to use mosques for military purposes as well. Turkey's Sharia-promoting Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan has long used imagery in an Islamist variant of a Turkish nationalist poem to exhort Muslims to this practice. Quote, the minarets are our bayonets, the domes are helmets, the mosques are barracks, and the faithful our army, unquote. Unlike the past U.S. practice of using military personnel and or defense funding to restore Christian churches, the use of such resources to build mosques, especially when combined with conduct that is clearly perceived as submissive to Sharia, is likely to exacerbate the threat, not attenuate it. Here's how columnist Diana West described the state of dhimmification of the U.S. military.
When the history of the post-9/11 era is told, what we will read about is a nation that sent armies into the Islamic world blind to the rules and culture of Islam and expecting the armies to accomplish missions that were set by governments that had no idea what we were sending men and women to die for. And what has happened as a result in this desperate attempt to make these incursions successful is a systemic introduction of Islamic law into the United States military in an effort to please and cajole these Islamic populations into doing our bidding. We're also seeing guidances that demand respect for the Quran, that demand divine treatment of an inanimate object, the Quran, and in other words, force our service members into compliance with Sharia. We are seeing this systematically implemented since the very day probably Guantanamo Bay opened and directives came down to put our military in gloves when they hold it, use their right hand, and other sorts of Sharia norms for handling a Quran is a very divine thing. We've even gotten to the point now where the most recent Quran directive issued by the United States military is, we will hold sacred the beliefs held sacred by others. This is the ultimate slide, the ultimate capitulation to Islam, the ultimate demise of the American way, because it shows that the military is placing the Quran over the Constitution.
It should come as no surprise, given the failure to understand the enemy promoted within the Defense Department by Team Obama and the latter's insistence on the military engaging assiduously in submissive behavior, that the warfighting strategy now being applied in Afghanistan reflects both of these predictably self-defeating defects. This quote from a senior commander in Afghanistan captures the central theory behind the so-called counterinsurgency or COIN strategy, applied first in Iraq and more recently in Afghanistan. The COIN strategy was the brainchild of General David Petraeus, a senior and highly accomplished combat commander in Iraq, who went on to become the top officer there, the leader of Central Command and the commanding general in Afghanistan before his retirement and appointment to his present post as CIA director. General Petraeus' predecessor as commander of International Security Assistance Force, or ISAF, in Afghanistan, General Stanley McChrystal made clear the submissive character of the minimum force, more risk, protect the civilian population at all costs character of the COIN strategy in an August 2009 document entitled Commander's Initial Assessment. Let's examine 4 ways in which the COIN strategy translates into perilous submission for America's warfighters. First, under successive commands, particularly in Afghanistan, American and Allied military personnel have been obliged to operate under highly constraining rules of engagement, the guidance that determines the circumstances under which combat can and cannot be undertaken. Pursuant to COIN, our troops are being treated as expendable rather than risk civilian casualties unnecessarily. Serious and sometimes fatal restrictions have been imposed on the use of direct and supporting fire. As the London Daily Mail reported on May 5, 2010, quote, "Under attack servicemen must now identify the exact nature of the threat, including the number of armed insurgents, before responding in kind. Previously, they could retaliate with force and call for air support." Unquote. Even more troubling is the fact that the very instinct often required to survive in combat is being rewired, undoing the troops' most basic military training. As General McChrystal told the BBC in August 2009, quote, "We're trying to build into the culture of our force tremendous sensitivity that everything they may do must be balanced against the possibility of hurting anyone." Unquote. A young American serviceman complained that, quote, "It's so hard to fight a war like this." Unquote. The truth is, at this point, we're not truly fighting a war in Afghanistan. Certainly not fighting to win. We are instead asking troops like Lance Corporal Anderson to submit at great and growing personal risk to these hamstringing rules of engagement in the hope of winning hearts and minds more likely to be alienated than attracted by our perceived weakness and submission. A second manifestation of the submissiveness of the U.S. military strategy can be found in various measures that have the effect of compounding the dangerously restrictive rules of engagement by increasing the exposure of American and Allied forces to the enemy as ISAF engages in what has been called, quote, "armed social work," unquote. Such a heightened risk was the predictable upshot of General McChrystal taking the rules of engagement to their logical next step. He pronounced that, quote, "subordinate commanders must have greater freedom with respect to setting force protection measures they employ in order to help close the gap between security forces and the people they protect," unquote. ISAF personnel have lost their lives or been severely wounded as a result of these sorts of not just risky, but reckless acts of submission. It's worth noting that Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta sensibly required that Afghan personnel be disarmed during his visit to their country in March 2012. Lest the Afghans be offended, however, U.S. Marines were also ordered to disarm. One can only imagine the sense of betrayal by their leadership those Marines felt, and how vulnerable they were when the Afghans among them were once again issued ammunition after Mr. Panetta and his traveling party were safely headed home. As the preceding discussion makes clear, much of the submissiveness U.S. forces are being ordered to engage in is rooted in Sharia blasphemy laws, that is, giving offense to Muslims with respect to their faith. This also applies more broadly to conduct that is exposing our personnel to other types of harm. For instance, U.S. personnel are exposed to parasites and other medical disorders as a result of the requirement that they eat Afghan food so as not to offend their hosts. How about this stunning example? In July 2011, the Daily Mail reported that British Commando Craig Smith, quote, claims troops were ordered to stand and watch when they spotted a Taliban fighter as the sound of shooting would wake up and upset the locals, unquote. Then there's the matter of submissiveness with respect to captured enemy combatants. Thanks in part to the Gitmo Bar that is, as we have seen, well represented in senior positions in the Obama Holder Justice Department, the treatment of detainees in military custody has been, by and large, not merely humane. It has been positively deferential to Muslim prisoners' aggressive, Sharia-driven demands for accommodations. Needless to say, the honoring of such demands has done nothing to reduce the various forms of verbal abuse and, whenever possible, the violent attacks to which guards are routinely subjected. Perhaps the most insidious of these forms of submission is the impact on the U.S. military of compelling it to accommodate to, or at least attempt to ignore, behavior that is anathema to Americans and other civilized people, and deeply corrosive to an institution built upon the best of Western traditions and values. Of many examples that could be cited, two warrant at least passing mention. At best, U.S. troops must tolerate the horrific treatment meted out to females under Sharia, what columnist Diana West calls, quote, the erasure of women, unquote. At worst, they must conform to its requirements themselves. The U.S. military is also, as a practical matter, being required to overlook the rampant practice of pedophilia in Afghanistan, including the appalling phenomenon known as Man Love Thursdays. It's hard to calculate the corrosive effect this sort of morally reprehensible submission will have over time on one of our most decent, principled, and high-integrity institutions, our armed forces, and the people who voluntarily serve in them. Regrettably, such assaults on the condition and esprit de corps of the U.S. military are not the only policies and initiatives undertaken by the Obama administration that are having the effect of undermining the armed forces. In few other areas is Mr. Obama's promise to fundamentally transform the United States being pursued with a greater vengeance than with respect to the United States' ability to maintain a global presence, project power, and preserve deterrence. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs General Martin Dempsey has warned that nothing less than America's status as a superpower is at stake. As we've discussed previously, such changes can only be heartening to America's Islamist enemies. They're being emboldened. Unfortunately, so are other actual and incipient foes like Russia, China, North Korea, and Venezuela. These are some of the most important ways in which President Obama's policies are eviscerating the U.S. defense capabilities. Any of these steps would be problematic in the best of times, coming as they are, both simultaneously and at a moment when the world is arguably as dangerous as it has been in decades, makes them downright irresponsible. That's especially true to the extent that Team Obama is exacerbating that threatening international environment through steps like the recognition of the Muslim Brotherhood, the undermining of Israel, the failure to stop Iran's nuclear weapons program, etc., that are described elsewhere in this course. Next, let's consider the Department of Homeland Security. As we've seen elsewhere in this course, DHS has been particularly targeted by Muslim Brotherhood and other pre-violent jihadist operatives. It's also been, pursuant to President Obama's pro-Islamist policies, particularly helpful in advancing the agenda of those operatives. A bit of a drill down is in order with respect to 5 vehicles within the DHS portfolio being used by our enemies to advance their influence operations and other threats. In both the originally published version of the Kheder Yerushalmi study and an expanded one that appeared in the December 2011 edition of Perspectives on Terrorism, the authors demonstrated that an empirical correlation could be drawn between, quote, actual manifest Sharia-related behaviors and the presence of violent and jihad-based literature, and further, the promotion of that literature, unquote. The following sorts of worrying behavior were chronicled. At 81% of the 100 mosques surveyed, materials advocating violence were present. At 84% of this sample, the imams recommended studying violence-positive texts, and 58% of the mosques invited guest imams known to promote violent jihad. Next, let's consider the Department of Homeland Security. As we've seen elsewhere in this course, DHS has been particularly targeted by Muslim Brotherhood and other pre-violent jihadist operatives. It's also, pursuant to President Obama's pro-Islamist policies, been particularly helpful in advancing the agenda of those operatives. Consider 5 vehicles within the DHS portfolio being used by our enemies to advance their influence operations and other threats. As we saw starting in Part 2 of this course, the Muslim Brotherhood's civilization jihad benefits greatly from information dominance. Accordingly, achieving and retaining such dominance is a high priority for the brothers and their allies. The fruits of their efforts can be seen in, among other places, the DHS Countering Violent Extremism Lexicon, Homeland Security Secretary Janet Napolitano became the object of ridicule for her department's blatant submission to the Islamist demands for inoffensive descriptions of the threat. The George W. Bush administration's preferred euphemism, terrorism, was initially replaced by man-caused disasters. That in turn gave way to violent extremism, a formulation that, as we've seen, suits the Muslim Brotherhood's desire to divert attention from the pre-violent civilization jihad and the fact that its impetus is not extremism, but mainstream Islam's Sharia doctrine. Such euphemisms also play into the Islamists' narrative that non-Muslim violent extremists pose as much a threat as do Muslim ones, and that therefore there is moral equivalence between the two. The corollary to this proposition is the demand that non-Muslim communities, from which non-Muslim violent extremists ostensibly spring, are deserving of as much scrutiny and counterterrorism effort as are Muslim communities. To that end, as counterterrorism expert and Team B2 member Patrick Poole first revealed, among other troubling elements, the latest version of the DHS lexicon, dated November 10, 2011, defines, quote, militia extremists, unquote, as, quote, groups or individuals who facilitate or engage in acts of violence directed at federal, state, or local government officials or infrastructure in response to their belief that the government deliberately is stripping Americans of their freedoms and is attempting to establish a totalitarian regime, unquote. How did we get to such a point, where the nature of the threat is obscured and the effort to counter it deflected at the federal government's agency with lead responsibility for Homeland Security? In part, of course, the answer is, as we've previously discussed, thanks to President Obama's pro-Islamist policies and the Muslim Brotherhood-tied personnel at the White House and elsewhere in government. But let's review who is helping to shape policy at the Department of Homeland Security. For starters, consider the DHS Advisory Council. This council is made up of a group of prominent present and former officials and private sector leaders. In Part 8 of this course, we learned that it also includes Mohammed El-Biari, an Islamist activist with myriad connections to the Muslim Brotherhood and Islamist causes, and an apparent record of using his access to government information and facilities in ways that are harmful to official situational awareness about and any efforts to counter the civilization jihad. Here's an exchange about El-Biari between Secretary Napolitano and Representative Louis Gohmert of Texas, one of the most knowledgeable and aggressive opponents of the Muslim Brotherhood and its stealthy jihad in the United States Congress today.
Secretary, since you seemed a little fuzzy about El-Biari, let me make sure you leave here understanding. He was a featured speaker at the tribute to the great Islamic visionary Ayatollah Khomeini, December 11th of 2004. You had him on your Countering Violent Extremism working group. You promoted him, and from your own website, Secretary Napolitano swears in Homeland Security Advisory Council members. You swore him in. And according to your testimony here today, that's where he got the security clearance. He has written glowingly of Qutb, on whom Osama bin Laden relied heavily for his barbarism justification. He has written against the trial and conviction of the Holy Land Foundation's funding of terrorism. He has still remained in this Homeland Security Advisory Council, and now he has accessed a week ago the state and local intelligence community database. He took documents that said for official use only and shopped them with national media. It appears not only is our security being compromised, a secure system, but he's using it to help his friend politically, the president. I've got one question, and it's not a gotcha question. There's nothing confusing about it. Before you came in here today, were you given information about El-Biari using the state and local intelligence community database and taking information he downloaded and shot the media? No. If anyone from Homeland Security, your staff, advised anyone else that you were briefed last night, they would be wrong. Is that correct? Yes. Thank you.
As we've seen, Mohammed El-Biari is also able to contribute to the Islamists' information dominance efforts by virtue of his membership on the DHS Advisory Committee's Countering Violent Extremism Working Group. This working group was established in response to February 2010 tasking by Secretary Napolitano asking the Advisory Committee to focus, quote, in particular on the issues of training, information sharing, and the adoption of community-oriented law enforcement approaches, unquote, to countering violent extremism. In addition to El-Biari and two other Muslim Brotherhood associated individuals introduced in Part 8, Dalia Mogahed and Mohammed Majid, the DHS Countering Violent Extremism Working Group has at least 5 other members with ties to Islamist organizations, agendas, or their enablers. Here's how the 5 were described in a briefing setting forth the group's spring 2010 recommendations. Nimco Ahmed with the Minneapolis City Council, Omar Alomari, Community Engagement Officer at the Ohio Department of Homeland Security, Asli Bali, a UCLA law professor, Asim Rehman, President, Muslim Bar Association of New York, and Nadia Romani, Director, American Muslim Civic Leadership Institute. The Department of Homeland Security has promulgated an approach to countering violent extremism that, if possible, places even more emphasis on community engagement than the President's national strategy on empowering local partners to prevent violent extremism. This is to be expected given that, according to a DHS fact sheet, whose release was timed to coincide with the August 2011 issuance of the new White House strategy, the department is, quote, implementing recommendations from its Homeland Security Advisory Council CVE working group, unquote, including, quote, developing a CVE curriculum for state, local, and tribal law enforcement focused on a community-oriented policing approach to combat violent crime and counter violent extremism, unquote. The fact sheet adds that DHS is, quote, expanding outreach to communities that may be targeted for recruitment by violent extremists, engaging those communities on issues of common interest, promoting greater awareness and understanding of federal resources, programs, and security measures, and addressing community concerns, unquote. Again, note the opportunity for the Muslim Brotherhood's so-called leaders of the Muslim community to hijack community-based policing and give priority to their manufactured grievances and victimhood. In fact, a March 29, 2011 study by the Center for Security Policy entitled Religious Bias Crimes 2000-2009, Muslim, Christian, and Jewish Victims, found that based on the most recently available FBI hate crime statistics, quote, from 2000 through 2009, for every 1 hate crime incident against a Muslim, there were 6 hate crime incidents against Jewish victims, a total of 1,580 Muslim incidents versus 9,692 Jewish incidents, unquote. The DHS fact sheet also declared that the Department of Homeland Security was, quote, helping facilitate relationships of trust among local communities, law enforcement, and state and local fusion centers through the Building Communities of Trust initiative. With our DOJ partners, lessons learned have resulted in guidance for law enforcement highlighting the importance of information sharing, responding to community concerns, and distinguishing between cultural behaviors and conduct that may legitimately reflect terrorism precursor activities, unquote. Unfortunately, an independent assessment of what the CVE working group would have us believe is simply, quote, cultural behavior, unquote, namely, adherence to Sharia in American mosques, actually correlates with what would reasonably be defined as, quote, terrorism precursor activities, unquote. This peer-reviewed study was first published in the summer of 2011 edition of Middle East Quarterly by Dr. Mordecai Kedar, a professor of Arabic and Middle East Studies at Bar-Ilan University in Israel, and David Yerushalmi, a litigator and expert on Sharia who served as a member of Team B2. In both the originally published version of the Kedar Yerushalmi study and an expanded one that appeared in the December 2011 edition of Perspectives on Terrorism, the authors demonstrated that an empirical correlation could be drawn between, quote, actual, manifest Sharia-related behaviors and the presence of violent and jihad-based literature, and further, the promotion of that literature, unquote. The following sorts of worrying behavior were chronicled. At 81% of the 100 mosques surveyed, materials advocating violence were present. At 84% of this sample, the imams recommended studying violence-positive texts, and 58% of the mosques invited guest imams known to promote violent jihad. Despite such inconvenient truths about the connection between Sharia-adherent Muslims' so-called cultural behavior and what are objectively, if not necessarily imminently, terrorism precursor activities, the Department of Homeland Security has promulgated yet another set of training guidelines at the recommendation of its Islamist-heavy Countering Violent Extremism Working Group. Here again, the organization responsible for issuing such training guidelines is not one with line responsibility for national or homeland security. Instead, it's the DHS Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. The following are among the problematic features of its guidelines. As a practical matter, since, at least as far as the Obama administration is concerned, quote, knowledgeable community leaders, unquote, means exclusively Muslim Brotherhood operatives, this guideline grants them what amounts to a veto over the trainers and their materials by the Department of Homeland Security and other federal agencies. Of course, what is meant by this guidance is that if individuals or organizations are part of a, quote, particular ethnic or religious community, unquote, ignore their behavior, especially if it can be construed as, quote, constitutionally protected, unquote. This is a formula that ensures the Islamists will be unhampered in pursuing their Sharia-directed civilization jihad under the cover of religious freedom. This direction reinforces the idea that Muslim American communities and their putative leaders not only have to be engaged in Homeland Security's efforts to protect the rest of us from threats emanating from their circles, they have to approve of who is doing the equipping of our defenders. It would have been approximately as absurd to have relied upon the American Communist Party to approve anti-communist operations during the Cold War, or the German-American Bund to prevent Nazi penetration and influence operations prior to and during World War II. Here's another insight into just how deep a penetration of the Obama Department of Homeland Security has been achieved by the Bund and CPUSA's contemporary counterpart, the Muslim Brotherhood. The Countering Violent Extremism Working Group actually recommends as a resource for community outreach a book published by the Muslim Public Affairs Council, a group that is, as we have learned, tied in numerous ways to the Brothers and their civilization jihadist agendas. Specifically, the MPAC website touts an endorsement by the CVE Working Group of its book entitled Building Bridges to Strengthen America, Forging an Effective Counterterrorism Enterprise Between Muslim Americans and Law Enforcement. Two observations are in order. First, as we discussed in Part 4, the title is a clear, if cynical, reference to Sayyid Qutb's quote about bridge building being only for the purpose of promoting dawah and bringing the infidel to Islam. And second, taking direction from Muslim Brotherhood-associated groups like the Muslim Public Affairs Council on how to conduct community-based law enforcement and countering of terrorism is doomed to fail, since such organizations are playing for the other side. Finally, yet another critical Homeland Security Department responsibility that is going woefully unfulfilled under Team Obama, to the benefit of, among others, Islamist enemies, involves securing the nation's borders. Incredibly, even as our frontiers remain largely porous and transited routinely by narco-traffickers, illegal aliens, and probably terrorists, Secretary Napolitano persists in misleading the American people about the true security status, particularly along America's southern border. For example, on March 25, 2011, she insisted that it, quote, is better now than it has ever been, unquote. This disconnect is especially troubling insofar as congressional hearings, including, notably, ones held by Representative Peter King's House Homeland Security Committee, have established that Iranian military and proxy forces, among them the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps' Quds Force, Hezbollah, and Hamas, have operatives in Latin America. Representative King has established, moreover, that, quote, hundreds, unquote, of Hezbollah agents are now inside the United States. Allowing them to reinforce and further arm at will is a formula for disaster here at home. Incredibly, the Obama administration has taken the state of Arizona to court to prevent it from enforcing federal law. Statutes that, as former federal prosecutor Andrew McCarthy caustically observes, Mr. Obama and his subordinates have chosen as a matter of executive branch policy not to uphold. Finally, under President Obama, even NASA, America's space agency, has been put in the service of an Islamist-style agenda. In a July 1, 2010 interview with Al Jazeera, NASA Administrator Charles Bolden revealed that, quote, before I became administrator, President Obama charged me with three things.
Third, and perhaps foremost, he wanted me to find a way to reach out to the Muslim world and engage much more with dominantly Muslim nations to help them feel good about their historic contribution to science and engineering, science, math, and engineering.
What is already certain, however, is that President Obama's pro-Islamist policies with respect to NASA, like those afflicting other departments and agencies of the U.S. government, are all the more egregious for their coming at a most inopportune time. With respect to NASA's portfolio, that means a moment when the United States is severely cutting back on its exploration of and even access to space, contributing to the ceding of preeminence there to potentially hostile nations like Communist China and perhaps others. As we've seen again and again, testimony by senior Obama administration officials before the Congress is one of the few readily accessible ways for the American people to get a sense of the full, appalling extent of our Islamist enemies' success in achieving information dominance over the U.S. government. One example was Representative Sue Myrick's February 2011 exchange with Director of National Intelligence James Clapper, in which he outrageously mischaracterized the Muslim Brotherhood. Another was the back and forth in May 2010 between Representative Lamar Smith and Attorney General Eric Holder about the threat we are facing from radical Islam. Then, in October 2011, we saw Representative Louis Gohmert trying to ascertain from DHS Secretary Janet Napolitano what someone like Mohammed El-Biari, who has extensive ties to the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamists, was doing on her department's advisory board. It's appropriate to close out our review of President Obama's pro-Islamist policies at the Defense Department with a necessarily extended attempt by Representative Dan Lundgren to elicit from Assistant Secretary of Defense Paul Stockton a straight answer about whether the Obama Pentagon perceives a threat from radical Islamic extremism.
Secretary Stockton, are we at war with violent Islamist extremism?
No, sir. We are at war with al-Qaeda, its affiliates, and adherents.
My question is violent Islamist extremism at war with us?
No, sir. We are being attacked by al-Qaeda and its allies.
Is al-Qaeda, can it be described as being an exponent of violent Islamist extremism?
The al-Qaeda are murderers with an ideological agenda.
That wasn't my question. My question was, is al-Qaeda acting out violent Islamist extremism?
Al-Qaeda is a violent organization dedicated to overthrowing the values that we intend to advance.
Yes or no?
Can I hear the question again? I'll make it as clear as I can. We are not at war with Islam.
I didn't ask that. I did not ask that, sir. I asked whether we're at war with violent Islamist extremism. That's my question.
No, we're at war with Al-Qaeda and its affiliates.
Al-Qaeda, how does Al-Qaeda define itself? Are they dedicated to violent Islamist extremism?
Al-Qaeda would love to convince Muslims around the world that the United States is at war with Islam. That's a prime propaganda tool, and I'm not going to aid and abet that effort to advance their propaganda goals.
Is there a difference between Islam and violent Islamist extremism?
Sir, with great respect, I don't believe it's helpful to frame our adversary as Islamic with any set of qualifiers that we might add, because we are not at war with Islam.
I understand that. I never said we were at war with Islam. One of the questions we're trying to deal with is the radicalization of Islam, is the radicalization of Islamic youth. And if we can't distinguish between violent Islamist extremism and Islam, then all this stuff about behavioral indicators doesn't mean anything. Well, let me ask you this question. Is it a behavioral indicator to put on your card that you're a soldier of Allah?
A behavioral indicator that you have a copy of Inspire magazine on your desk?
That's not my question. My question is it a behavioral indicator to put on your card that you are a soldier of Allah, as Major Hassan did?
We have behavioral indicators now that enable our personnel, our supervisors, to focus on detecting indicators of violent extremism that reflect the lessons learned from Fort Hood.
Okay, is that a lesson learned? That if you put soldier of Allah on your card, that you ought to follow up and investigate that?
We're training our supervisors to follow up on appropriate indicators and exercise the leadership they need in order to provide for effective reporting and intervention.
You agree with the statement of someone representing the Department of Defense on the weekend after the shooting that it would be a greater tragedy to lose our program of diversity than what had occurred?
Well, let me go back to something Chairman King said. I was trained up by Senator Moynihan. There was nobody less politically correct than Senator Moynihan. I follow the truth wherever it takes me, and I strongly support the programs of the Department of Defense that focus on Al-Qaeda and behavioral indicators. This is not about political correctness. This is about defeating our adversary.
Sir, I would disagree with you that it may not be about political correctness. We are here talking about the fact that we now have to have behavioral indicators. I agree with that. But my question is, if someone gives inflammatory remarks, as did Major Hassan, in an open setting, if he has on his card that he was a soldier of Allah, it seems to me to be beyond common sense to think those are not behavioral indicators. So my question is, if I'm a member of the military today and I see those two events or those two circumstances, would it be appropriate for me to report those as behavioral indicators? Now, that's not a question of whether or not you're being politically correct, sir. I'm asking to answer that specific question. If I'm a soldier and ask you that question, what do you tell me?
Inflammatory rhetoric of the sort associated with Major Hassan that needs to be reported, and our officers are trained up now to report on that behavior.
I thank you, and I appreciate that.
As we noted at the outset of this part of our course, the examples cited here of the policies adopted under the Obama presidency that have been favored by the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamist enemies of the United States are necessarily just a representative sample. There are still more publicly acknowledged instances in which decisions have been taken by Mr. Obama or his subordinates that are also inimical to American freedoms, interests, and security. Surely, moreover, there are still others that have yet to come to light. What is known is damning enough. What remains to be discovered can only be speculated about at this point, but knowing what we do about the kinds of people given access to top U.S. policymakers and, in some cases, actually given such responsibilities themselves, and what we've learned about the policy and other implications of such penetration. The groundwork has been laid for the last part of this course. What do we do about all this? Part 10 addresses the sorts of actions that concerned Americans can and must take in light of the threat posed by Sharia and the efforts of the enemy within to bring it here.